Welcome to Justice 7 by 7, an informational podcast brought to you by the San Francisco's District Attorney's Victim Services Division. In this podcast, we will explore issues in our community with an emphasis on a trauma-informed approach.
My name is Abby Cordova. I am a victim advocate with the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. In this episode, we're highlighting Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We know that domestic violence can happen to anyone. It has no cultural or socioeconomic boundaries. In this podcast, you will hear from the Assistant District Attorney, Michael Swart, who tried Lee Bell for the murder of Perla Lewis. You will also hear from Aisha Lewis, who is a daughter of Perla Lewis. We want to provide the audience with a trigger warning. This podcast contains material that some listeners might find disturbing in relation to domestic violence.
So Lee Bell and Perla Lewis met in August of 2008, and they began a dating relationship. Oftentimes in domestic violence type cases, these dating relationships start out what many people call the honeymoon period. Just like any other type of dating relationship where people are really into each other, they can't wait to see each other. And Lee Bell, as you're going to see, was a master manipulator at preying on someone such as Perla, who was particularly vulnerable at this point in time in her life. So as I said, they started dating in August of 2008. They had their honeymoon period, and then the violence began December 31st of 2008.
I'm sitting with Aisha, the daughter of victim Perla Lewis, who was murdered at the hands of her domestic violence partner. On May 18, 2010, the media reported that her body was found in a suitcase in the Bay. Lee Bell was arrested on June 4, 2010 for her murder, and 8 years later, he was found guilty. Aisha now works around domestic violence awareness and prevention, focusing on abused loved ones. Thank you for joining us, Aisha. I would like to start by talking about your mother, Perla Lewis.
So I remember finding out about my mom's murder, and trying to make sense of everything that was going on, from the media to just the sheer, trying to figure out what happened, how my mom even ended up in this particular situation. And so I remember shortly after finding out that she was killed that I began to pray, and I was asking God to really show me what it was that I needed to get from what was going on, trying to make sense of, my mom no longer being here, trying to make sense of her in this relationship, trying to make sense of how she even ended up as what a lot of people know as a news story. And as I began to pray, I asked God to show me what it is that He wanted me to learn from this particular situation. So the very next day, I went with my brother to clean out my mom's room and get all of the stuff that belonged to her. And I remember walking into the room, and on the walls, she had the words "Believe in Love" all over the room. And so at that moment, I felt as though my mom was speaking directly to me through what was on the walls. And I took down the words "Believe in Love," and it dawned on me at that moment that my mom always expressed to us two very important concepts about life, which was to, one, believe in yourself, and above all, to love no matter what. And while my mom was in a relationship in which the love was not genuine or authentic, she really in her mind thought that she would be able to love him through all of his insecurities and all of his mishaps and things of that sort. And so from that point on, I have really vowed to make it a point in my life to express to people exactly what true love is and what it means, and that love doesn't hurt, and then to help that transcend to others so that they understand more about healthy relationships and what that looks like and what that feels like, as opposed to what I consider fake or pseudo love that sometimes is shown through relationships that end up in domestic violence or domestic abuse. So in that moment, I definitely felt as though my mom was speaking to me, helping me try to process through everything that had been going on, and to also leave the legacy of belief in yourself, belief in others, as well as the legacy of love, the love of yourself, as well as the true, genuine love of others.
This case was all over the news once they identified your mother. How did this affect you and your family?
So I'll never forget when my mom was killed. There was a time where we were trying to figure out exactly what was going on and how to process her death, and asking the authorities to wait to release her name for a little while so that we can talk to our family and figure out exactly what was going on. And once we released my mom's name, I'll never forget that there was a particular reporter with the Channel 2 News who asked for a specific interview, and I granted her the interview to, ask questions and kind of talk about my mom and highlight who she was. And the very next day when the interview aired, or the story aired, the light that the particular reporter put my mom in was very negative. I remember them kind of talking about the fact that she was homeless at various points in her adult life, that she dealt with drug addiction and alcoholism and things of that sort, and making my mom out to be more of a victim, like victimizing her as the victim in that segment, and how infuriated my family was by the story. And so they contacted the producers. Of course, the producers contacted my family back and apologized. They pulled the segments. But I remember my grandmother, who my mom was her only child. And at first, when my mom was killed, did not really want us to speak out about my mom and what was going on and things of that sort. But I remember her, after watching the segment where they tried to slander my mom on air, and how she looked at me and basically told me, "Isha, let them know who she really is." And so from that point on, we always made it a point to talk about Perla Lewis, the mom, the daughter, the grandmother, and the friend, because regardless of the struggles that she had in life, she was still my mother. She was still my grandmother's daughter. She was still my kid's grandmother, and the friend that she was to everyone that she came in contact with, even through her struggles.
Before we started recording, we talked a little bit about going to meet him in jail. Can you speak to that?
What I told him before I left, and I meant, was that I forgave him for what he had done, and that even though he had physically taken my mom from us, that he would never take her spirit, and he would never take who she was. And so every single time he would be in court, I told him that I would make it a point to be there. And for the very long 8 years that it took for him to finally come to trial, and sometimes it would be every month, every other month at some points during the 8 years, I was there, sitting in there, sometimes by myself, or other times with various representatives of different agencies, or someone from victim services. So I definitely want to highlight one particular day that I remember going into court, and many times we were in court, there were representatives, again, from the Domestic Violence Consortium, as well as there's a group that does court case watching and victim services. But there was this one particular time during the trial that we were running late from the East Bay on our way to court, and I remember walking in and the entire right side of the courtroom was filled with people from different agencies, from interns in the DA's office to some family members, as well as members of the community. And I remember having this sense of overwhelming gratitude for the fact that even though this happened to my family, that there's been a community that has been walking with us through the process and holding our hands and wiping our tears and hugging us. And I remember on that particular day just how grateful my heart was for all of the support that we've had.
You shared so many thoughts and feelings with us thus far. Can you tell us what was going through your mind at sentencing?
There were times where I felt almost uncomfortable when people were excited about his sentence. And then there were other times where I felt relieved of my duties of having to come back and forth to San Francisco. And then there was a sense of doing all of this for my mom. And so I made it a point, throughout the trial to represent my mom. We actually had wristbands that we as a family that we wore and that we gave to everyone that supported us. So we wore purple wristbands during the trial. And then the day of the sentencing, I had to represent my mom to the utmost. So I wore a pair of her tennis shoes that I sometimes wear when I feel that I really want to walk in her shoes. And so I remember wearing those tennis shoes on that particular day. I also remember the fact that my children, even though they didn't attend the trial, still had the experience of losing their grandmother and having to watch their mom and their aunt and uncles go through such a trying time. And so I also allowed them to come into court on the sentencing day and express to the court how they felt about losing their grandmother. And I remember my youngest son getting up, and when it was time for him to actually read his statement, many people don't even know this, but he did not read his statement. He actually spoke from his heart at the age of 10 on how the impact affected him of losing his grandmother. And if you were in the courtroom, then you know that there was not a dry eye in the courtroom when he finished, because it took him a while to even talk. It took him about a good 5 minutes before he could even get his words together. And so once he finally shared what he had to share, again, there wasn't a dry eye. And I remember feeling, even in that moment, like an emptiness of loss and like a void. And the fact that, we had been through this long journey of 8 years, and at the end of the day, it was, the trial was about my mother. And what I highlighted during my impact statement was the fact that we had had 8 years of having to go on this journey with Lee and what he had done. And I was over talking about him. I was over his rights and things of that sort. And so what I highlighted in my impact statement was all about my mom. I even looked at him and told him, we've had enough of you. Now I want to talk about the person who my mom was and who she was to me, and how she was my number one cheerleader, and that I lost that on May 18th. That she was, an awesome grandmother, and that I lost that on May 18th. And that she was the only child to my grandmother, and that on May 18th my grandmother lost her only child. And then subsequently, a few years later, my grandmother passed away from a broken heart. And so just to really highlight the impact that my mom's death had was what the feelings that I had around sentencing. It wasn't a time of celebration. It was not a time of, high fives and things of that sort for me. I understand the idea behind the fact that he would be sentenced to, 20 years. But for me, it wasn't a time of celebration because at the end of the day, we were basically highlighting the fact that my mom was no longer here.
Thank you for sharing your deep sentiments about how you felt at sentencing. I can't imagine the emptiness and void you felt at that time. How were you able to move forward?
Honestly, after the death of my mom, I was pushed almost into the role of an advocate simply because I did not want my mom's death to go in vain. So I took it upon myself to want to explain or just describe to other people what it felt like, one, to be in a place of losing my mom the way that we did, but to also show through my family that even though something so traumatic and tragic has happened, that we still are overcoming, we still, show love, that we still want to honor my mom even in death and highlight her legacy of love. And so that is how I ended up in the role of an advocate, just wanting to be the voice for those who may not want to step up and say something, and have said something but just don't feel like they are supported when they share or when they go to the authorities. Just being a voice for them so that they know that there are agencies out there that help, honestly, that are, in the trenches doing the work, trying to get the word out there about all of the different services that are offered, as well as that the judicial system is there to help.
Any last words you would like to share with us?
I definitely wanted to share a speech that I gave one time on the steps of City Hall about shining the light on domestic violence. So hopefully this will encourage and this will motivate as well as leave an impact on those who are listening. I want to shine the light on women and men who struggle with low self-esteem, deal with controlling partners, and emotional, financial, physical, and sexual abuse daily. For people who just want to be loved. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. That's true love. I want to shine the light for all of the children who live in the homes and witness the abuse firsthand, who go to bed at night and have nightmares. They don't know how to process their anger. For our daughters and our sons to understand love should not hurt. Also for our sons who are twice as likely to abuse their own partners and children in their adult life. It is not okay to put your hands on a man, woman, or child and cover it up with the word love. I also want to shine the light on all churches, organizations, social workers, advocates, and officials supporting women and men who have stepped away from toxic relationships. There is so much support for you. You do not have to stay there. As a matter of fact, I beg you to get out now, because tomorrow may be too late. Tomorrow never came for my mom. I especially want to shine the light for all the women and men who have been senselessly taken from our families at the hands of someone who claimed to love them. We have had a lot of sleepless nights, range of feelings, empty spaces that we will never be able to fill. There have been accomplishments, promotions, personal achievements, yet still longing for our mother to celebrate with or encourage us to continue on when it seems rough. But through it all, we are still standing. I am here to shine the light and vow personally to do whatever it takes to bring about awareness to domestic violence, to speak out, to sit in, to meet, write, or whatever. While the city of San Francisco has so much to celebrate, we cannot forget the other nameless faces because we still have so far to go in the fight against domestic violence. But you are not alone. I want to shine a light on domestic violence for my mom, Perla Ann Lewis, full of love, tenacity, sass, and loyalty. My friend, encourager, and number one cheerleader. Her life is more than a news headline or a statistic on a fact sheet. She was a daughter, mother, grandmother, and friend. She will be the first to give you her last. That is what the world lost on May 18, 2010. Lastly, I want to shine the light on my mother's rich legacy she left behind. This journey of losing her has taught me so much about the true meaning of love and forgiveness. Daily I choose to continue to love others despite what I've been through, and forgiveness is not an option. It is mandatory for my growth and healing. I also recognize love will not and should not ever hurt. Martin Luther King said it best, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And that's why I am here to shine the light on domestic violence.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you or a loved one are experiencing domestic violence, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. And check out our Instagram, Justice 7x7, for local resources on how to get help.